The city was alive with a hum of early morning activity. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a golden hue over the towering buildings that lined the streets. Car horns blared, distant sirens wailed, and the chatter of people starting their day filled the air. Among the bustling crowd, Marcus Turner walked with a quiet confidence that set him apart. He was a man in his late 30s, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit that fit him perfectly. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he made his way down the sidewalk, a warm smile playing on his lips. Marcus had just finished breakfast at a local diner, a place he frequented whenever he had the time. The staff knew him by name, and they always made sure his order was just right: scrambled eggs, turkey bacon, and a side of fruit. As Marcus approached his car, a sleek black sedan parked on the street, he felt the familiar buzz of his phone in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from his mother, reminding him about their dinner plans that evening. Smiling, he typed out a quick reply, letting her know he hadn't forgotten. Family was everything to him. Just as he was about to unlock his car, Marcus noticed two police officers walking toward him. Their eyes were fixed on him, and their expressions were hard, unreadable. Marcus didn't recognize them, but that wasn't surprising. New officers often rotated through the neighborhood. What was unusual, though, was the intensity of their gaze. Marcus had grown up knowing how to handle himself around the police, especially as a black man. His father, Elijah Turner, had taught him early on to always stay calm, be respectful, and never give them a reason to escalate a situation. Those lessons were etched into his mind. "Excuse me, sir," one of the officers called out as they approached. Marcus stopped and turned to face them, still holding his phone in one hand. "Yes, officer," Marcus replied, his voice steady and polite. He noticed the name on the officer's badge, Officer Harris. The other officer, Officer Daniels, stood slightly behind, his hand resting on his belt near his holster. "Can I see some ID?" Harris asked, his tone sharp, almost demanding. There was no greeting, no explanation for why they had approached him. Marcus had been through situations like this before, but something about this encounter felt different. There was a tension in the air that made his instincts kick in. "May I ask why?" Marcus responded, keeping his voice calm. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he also knew his rights. He hadn't done anything wrong, and there was no reason for them to ask for his identification. Harris's eyes narrowed, and a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Just show us your ID, sir. It's a simple request." Marcus held the officer's gaze for a moment, then slowly reached into his jacket pocket. "All right," he said, pulling out his wallet. "But I'd still like to know why I'm being asked for it." As he handed over his driver's license, he noticed Daniels shift slightly, as if preparing for something. Marcus's senses heightened, but he kept his composure. Harris took the ID and looked it over, but his expression didn't change. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Harris asked, his tone accusatory. Marcus's eyebrows furrowed slightly in confusion. "I'm just heading to my car," he answered truthfully. "Is there a problem?" Harris ignored the question. "Where are you coming from?" "I had breakfast at the diner down the street," Marcus replied. "Like I said, is there a problem, officer?" Harris's eyes flicked up to Marcus's, and there was a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, before he handed the ID back. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," he said, the smirk returning. "You match the description of someone we're looking for." Marcus's stomach tightened. He knew where this was going. It was a familiar story. Black man in a nice neighborhood, dressed well, must be up to something. He had heard it all before, but it didn't make it any easier to deal with. "I see," Marcus said carefully. "Well, I'm sure it's a misunderstanding. I'm just here to get to my car and head to work." Harris didn't seem to hear him. Instead, he took a step closer, his posture more aggressive. "What kind of work do you do?" "I'm a lawyer," Marcus replied, keeping his voice even. "I have a meeting in an hour, so if there's nothing else, I'd like to be on my way." That seemed to catch Harris off guard. His smirk faltered, but only for a second. "A lawyer, huh? You don't say." Daniels, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "You sure you're not hiding anything? Got anything illegal in that car of yours?" Marcus could feel the tension rising. He knew how these situations could spiral out of control. He had to stay calm, had to defuse it. "There's nothing illegal in my car, officer. You're welcome to check, but I'd prefer if you didn't waste your time. I'm just trying to get to work." Harris's eyes hardened. "You don't get to decide how we do our job. Step away from the car." Marcus hesitated. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the situation was quickly becoming dangerous. He had to make a decision, comply and hope it didn't escalate further, or stand his ground and risk things getting worse. His father's voice echoed in his mind, urging him to stay calm, to be smart. "All right," Marcus said slowly, raising his hand slightly to show he wasn't a threat. "I'll step back." He took a step away from the car, and as he did, Harris moved closer, his hand now resting on the handle of his baton. Marcus's heart raced, but he kept his expression neutral. He couldn't let them see any fear. Without warning, Harris grabbed Marcus's arm and twisted it behind his back. The suddenness of the move caught Marcus off guard, and he winced in pain. Before he could react, Daniels was on him too, forcing him down to the ground. "Hey, what are you doing?" Marcus protested, trying to keep his voice calm, but the pain in his shoulder made it difficult. He wasn't resisting, but the officers were treating him as if he was. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest," Harris said coldly as he tightened the cuffs around Marcus's wrists. Marcus's mind raced. Resisting arrest? He hadn't resisted anything. He had done everything they asked, tried to reason with them, tried to stay calm. But it didn't matter. They had made up their minds the moment they saw him. By now, the commotion had drawn the attention of people nearby. An elderly woman, Mrs. Agnes Carter, who lived in the apartment building across the street, watched in horror from her balcony. She knew Marcus. She had seen him in the neighborhood many times and knew he wasn't a troublemaker. "What are you doing to him?" she called out, her voice trembling with outrage. "He didn't do anything wrong." A young couple walking their dog had also stopped to watch. The man pulled out his phone and started recording. "This is messed up," he muttered to his girlfriend. "They're arresting him for nothing." Marcus caught sight of the phone recording, and for a brief moment he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe the footage would help him later. Maybe it would show people the truth of what happened. But for now he was powerless. As the officers pulled Marcus to his feet, he forced himself to stay calm, to focus. He knew he had to be careful with what he said next. Anything could be used against him. As they led him towards a police car, the crowd began to grow. More people stopped to watch, to record, to shout their disapproval at the officers. "This isn't right," one man shouted from across the street. "He didn't do anything." But Harris and Daniels ignored them, their faces set with cold determination. They pushed Marcus into the back of a squad car, slamming the door shut behind him. Before they could drive away, Marcus turned his head to look out the window at the crowd. He could see the concern, the anger, the confusion on their faces. He took a deep breath, knowing he had to say something, even if it was just a few words. "This isn't over," he said loudly, his voice carrying through the thin glass. "This isn't over." The words hung in the air as the car pulled away, leaving the stunned crowd behind. Inside the car, Marcus's mind raced with thoughts of what would happen next, of how he would fight this, of how he would make sure justice was served. The police station was a stark contrast to the bustling streets outside. Cold gray walls, harsh fluorescent lights, and the constant hum of activity set the scene. Officers moved briskly through the corridors, some chatting, others focused on their tasks. The station was busy, but there was an underlying tension in the air, the kind that made people speak in hushed tones and glance over their shoulders. Marcus Turner was led through the station's front doors, his hands still cuffed behind his back. Officer Harris and Officer Daniels flanked him, their expressions unreadable as they passed through the booking area. A few officers glanced up, their eyes narrowing slightly as they took in Marcus's appearance. He was clearly not the usual suspect they brought in, a well-dressed black man with an air of calmness that seemed out of place. "Over here," Harris barked, steering Marcus toward a desk where a tired-looking officer sat behind a computer. The officer glanced up, then down at the screen, barely acknowledging Marcus's presence. "Name," the officer asked, his fingers poised over the keyboard. "Marcus Turner," Harris replied before Marcus could speak. The officer typed the name into the system, his eyes scanning the screen. He frowned slightly but didn't say anything. Instead, he motioned for Harris to bring Marcus over to the fingerprinting station. "Let's get this over with," Harris muttered, pushing Marcus forward. Marcus didn't resist. He knew better than to give them any reason to make things worse. As they took his fingerprints, he remained silent, his mind racing. He couldn't believe this was happening. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. But he knew he had to stay calm, had to think clearly. This wasn't the first time he had faced this kind of situation, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Once the fingerprinting was done, Harris and Daniels led Marcus to a small holding cell at the back of the station. The cell was cramped, with a narrow bench along one wall and a metal toilet in the corner. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and something else, something sour and unpleasant. They uncuffed him and shoved him inside. "Make yourself comfortable," Daniel sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You might be here for a while." Marcus sat down on the bench, taking a deep breath. He didn't respond to the taunts. There was no point. He knew they were trying to provoke him, trying to get a reaction. But he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. As Harris and Daniels walked away, they exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They had done their job, brought in another troublemaker, and now they could move on to whatever came next. But there was something about this arrest that nagged at Harris, something that made him uneasy. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the way Marcus had handled himself, the calmness, the confidence, it didn't fit the profile of someone they usually picked up. "Think he's a lawyer, huh?" Daniel scoffed as they walked back to the front desk. "Probably just another punk with a fancy suit." "Yeah," Harris muttered, though his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't so sure anymore. Something about Marcus was off, but he couldn't figure out what it was. He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. It didn't matter. They had their orders, and they had followed them. That was all there was to it. But as they reached the desk, a young officer who had been quietly observing the scene stepped forward. His name was Officer Stevens, and he had been with the department for only a few months. He was eager to prove himself, to show that he could handle the job, but he was also smart, smarter than most gave him credit for. "Hey, Harris," Stevens called out, his voice low. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Harris glanced at him, frowning. "What is it?" Stevens hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "That guy you just brought in, Marcus Turner. I think I know who he is." Harris's frown deepened. "What are you talking about?" Stevens leaned in closer, lowering his voice even more. "I saw him in a news article a few weeks ago. He's not just a lawyer. He's a civil rights attorney. A pretty big deal, too. He's been involved in some major cases, high-profile stuff." Harris's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked his surprise. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Stevens replied. "I didn't recognize him at first, but when I heard the name, it clicked. You might want to be careful with this one. If he's who I think he is, this could blow up in our faces." Harris didn't respond immediately. He felt a knot form in his stomach, but pushed it down. This couldn't be true. They had arrested him fair and square. There was no way he could be someone important. But the doubt was there now, nagging at him. "I'll handle it," Harris said curtly, dismissing Stevens with a wave of his hand. But as he turned away, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. Stevens watched Harris walk off, then pulled out his phone. He quickly scrolled through his contacts, finding the number he needed. With a deep breath, he dialed, praying he was making the right decision. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah. Captain, it's Stevens," he said, keeping his voice low. "We have a situation here at the station. I think you need to know about it." Meanwhile, back in the holding cell, Marcus sat quietly, his thoughts focused. He knew this wasn't just about him. This was about something bigger. He had been targeted. Of that he was certain. But he didn't know why. As he waited, he kept his composure, refusing to let the fear take over. He had been through worse, and he knew he would get through this too. An hour passed before anything happened. The door to the holding area swung open, and a woman stepped inside. She was in her late 30s, with sharp eyes and an air of authority that made everyone take notice. Her name was Lieutenant Kate Thompson, and she was new to the station, having been transferred from another precinct just a few weeks earlier. She was still getting to know the team, but she had already made it clear that she was not someone to be underestimated. Thompson's gaze swept over the room, taking in the officers going about their business. She spotted Harris and Daniels at the front desk, talking quietly among themselves. Something about their demeanor caught her attention. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now they were telling her that something was off. "Harris, Daniels," she called out, walking over to them. "What's going on here?" Harris looked up, surprised to see her. "Nothing much, ma'am. Just another day." Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Really? Because I heard you brought someone in this morning, a man named Marcus Turner." Harris stiffened slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Yes, ma'am. We did." "And what was the charge?" she asked, her tone calm but probing. "Resisting arrest," Harris replied, his voice steady. "We had reason to believe he was involved in suspicious activity. When we questioned him, he refused to cooperate." Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Did he now?" Harris nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Thompson didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied Harris's face, searching for any sign that he was lying. She had dealt with officers like him before, men who thought they could bend the rules as long as it suited them. But she was different. She had come up through the ranks by doing things by the book, and she expected her team to do the same. "Take me to him," she said finally, her voice leaving no room for argument. Harris hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Right this way, ma'am." As they walked toward the holding cells, Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than Harris was letting on. When they reached Marcus's cell, she stopped, her gaze locking onto the man inside. He was sitting on the bench, his hands folded in his lap, his posture relaxed despite the circumstances. There was something about him, something that made her pause. "This is him?" she asked, turning to Harris. "Yes, ma'am," Harris confirmed. "Like I said, he resisted arrest, so we had no choice but to bring him in." Thompson didn't respond right away. Instead, she opened the cell door and stepped inside. Marcus looked up, meeting her gaze with calm, steady eyes. He didn't seem intimidated, but he also didn't seem defiant. He was composed. "Mr. Turner," Thompson said, her voice measured. "I'm Lieutenant Kate Thompson. I'm here to ask you a few questions." "Of course, Lieutenant," Marcus replied politely. "I'm happy to cooperate." Thompson nodded, appreciating Marcus's calm demeanor. "I've been told that you resisted arrest, which led to your being brought in. I'd like to hear your side of a story." Marcus kept his gaze steady. "Lieutenant, I did no such thing. I complied with every instruction given to me by Officers Harris and Daniels. I was walking to my car when they stopped me. I asked them why I was being detained, and that simple question seemed to escalate the situation. Before I knew it, I was handcuffed and accused of resisting arrest, despite following their orders." Thompson listened carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed Marcus's words. There was something about his tone, calm, measured, but with an underlying firmness, that suggested he wasn't